All right, welcome back. 2 years ago, the largest anti-government protest since the 1959 Castro Revolution took place in Cuba. Thousands marched on the streets of the island to demand a change in living conditions. The uprising spread to South Florida and way beyond.
Tonight, we reflect on what sparked the protests, how the Cuban government responded, and, of course, what's next. Coordinator of the Assembly for the Cuban Resistance, Orlando Gutierrez, joins us now. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Take us back to July 11th, 2021. We saw the people taking to the streets in Cuba. Then we saw them even shutting down the Palmetto here in South Florida. What were they protesting about? What did the people of Cuba want then and still now?
Well, thank you for inviting me. I think that July 11th, 2021 was the beginning of an uprising. And it took place on a national level throughout Cuba. Over 50 cities participated in a country where there's so much repression. And I think people were very consistent in what they were demanding: freedom, down with communism, and a slogan which has become a reference point for all of us: homeland and life, patria y vida. They want to live in their land with freedom, and they want to be able to dedicate their lives to their family, their thoughts, their beliefs, without a regime constantly repressing them.
Orlando, I want to ask you a question coming from a Cuban American. And it's been a long time that the Cuban people have suffered. We're in agreement that it's an oppressive government. We're in agreement that they have a horrible economic system and that Cubans are leaving and risking their lives. And you introduced me to a Cuban who's living in South America. There's a colony of 35,000 in Uruguay, of all places. We've been dispersed by this terrible government. But here in this country, we can't do much about the Cuban government. We can do something about U.S. policy. Yet, we have an embargo that's been in place for 60 years, and nothing has changed. Why do people still continue supporting this policy?
Well, I think the regime in Cuba is not accidentally authoritarian, it's intentionally totalitarian.
Right.
And I think that engaging with a regime such as that will only empower it further. Look at what's happening with China. China has become a great threat to us because we have invested in China, we have believed in them. U.S. policy towards Cuba has not been consistent. It has not been applied in a manner which can bring about change. There's a policy in the books, the Cuban Freedom Act, Libertad, which calls for regime change. That is the only way Cuba will have a chance to live and to prosper, because this regime will stay in power no matter what, unless the Cuban people receive consistent support to bring about the end of the regime. That hasn't happened. The embargo has gone up to a certain level, but it has never been fully applied, and the policy has been very inconsistent. You can't...
What is that consistent support that you're talking about?
Well, I think for example, it took years to ban the use of U.S. stolen properties in Cuba by foreign companies.
Right.
That finally happened, and that's affected the regime. Right now, Cuban troops are being sent to Belarus and to Ukraine to participate in one more conflict as proxies for the Russians. There should be an immediate response to that. The Europeans are sanctioning Russia, but they're financing the regime in Cuba at a rate of $8.1 billion in the last 4 years. As long as those inconsistencies remain, this regime will remain in power. And as long as it's in power, it will try to spread its venom throughout Latin America.
In Granma yesterday, the Cuban government and the communist-run party essentially said that the U.S. government had some direct responsibility in the uprisings from July 11th of 2021. Is that as a direct result of the policy in place in the U.S., or are they saying or alleging that the U.S., planted the seeds to have this begin on the island?
If any normal government had 200,000 people simultaneously in the streets demanding freedom, something would happen. Early elections, referendums, plebiscites. They have to blame the U.S. for the discontent of the Cuban people. The Cuban people have risen up repeatedly against that regime. July 11th has been the most successful and the one that has the greatest reach inside Cuba. And the regime remains terrified of what happened that day, because protests have continued throughout the island since July 11th of 2021.
Meantime, they're voting with their feet, because you gave me a statistic that really was mind-boggling. The number of Cubans born on the island compared to the number who are leaving the island is just mind-boggling, isn't it?
Yes, 95,000 Cubans were born in the island last year, 400,000 left. Wow. And I think people have left because they wanted to bring down the regime, but they need consistent support. A totalitarian regime is different from any other kind of dictatorship. And unless there's a concerted effort by the international community to help them, it doesn't happen.
It's been a long wait for the Cuban people.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for your insight.
Thank you, Orlando.